Welcome to Psych Sessions at Work, where we talk about jobs with the people who study jobs. I'm your host, Janet Peters. Each episode in this series features work psychologists that share what it means to be an industrial organizational psychologist, the type of work they do, and reflections from their own career paths. I'm excited to share these insights with you, so let's get to work.
Right. Hi, I'm here with Dr. Stefanie Johnson. She's an associate professor of organizational leadership and information analytics. And Stefanie, do you want to start off telling us a little bit about what that means, organizational leadership and information analytics? Tell us a little bit about your job.
It's a mouthful, right? So my department is, I guess, like maybe organizational behavior, or you might think of it as human resources within the College of Business at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Why we have the name Organizational Leadership and Information Analytics, I have no idea. I guess many people in our department do really big data research. So looking at, I might look at consumer decision-making, or even things like how insurance companies make decisions about how much to charge people's premiums, but using really, really big data, often publicly available data, to inform business. And so I think that's the information analytics part. But what I do is actually leadership. So that's the first thing.
Yeah. Okay, so tell me about that. Tell me about how an IO psychologist fits into a business department, and what's your piece of that puzzle, and what do you do?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say, my name is Stefanie Johnson, and I am an IO psychologist. Even if I am in a business school, I always identify as an IO psychologist. But in business school, so a lot of things like human resources and leadership, the foundations really come from more core disciplines like psychology or sociology.
Yes.
So I think that's how I ended up there. But actually, my heart has always been in IO psychology. Like I was a high school student, and this was like the 1990s. Okay. So the internet had just been invented, and I used my dial-up like AOL account.
Oh yeah.
I know how old you are, so you're not that old to know this.
I had older siblings, Stefanie, so I lived that life vicariously through them.
Okay, I'll believe you. But I was taking like an AP high school psychology class, and I loved it. And IO psychology is like, chapter 26 of every high school textbook. It's like the last chapter. And
if it's in there, honestly, if it's in there at all.
That's true. I think maybe it was an appendix, but I thought it was super interesting. And so I looked up on the American Psychological Association webpage. I think there was actually even a PSYOP, Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology webpage, psyop.org. But I'm not totally sure on that because it's a very long time ago. But I looked it up, and one of the topics of study or interest for IO psychologists was leadership. And for whatever weird reason, even as a high school student, I just was super into leadership. And so I decided to become an industrial organizational psychologist, and I never looked back.
Oh, wow. So you knew early on like that you were into it, because I'll tell you, I did not know until I was like maybe a junior in college, because I'd never heard of it. It wasn't in intro classes. It wasn't in my intro class. And we didn't have an IO psychologist at where I went to undergraduate. And so I sort of stumbled on it on my own, kind of like you, where it's like, hey, what's this chapter at the back?
Yes.
But mine was much later. So you knew from like before you even got to college.
Even more strange than that is I knew, or I stated at that time, who would have ever thought that this would come true, Janet, but that I wanted to be an IO psychology professor as a high school student. And that's like, I'm sure this is not fascinating to other people because like, who cares? But for me, it was super, looking back, so weird, because neither of my parents had been to college. So the thought of like, here I am in high school and I'm like, what do I want to study in college? And then I'm like, oh, industrial organizational psychology. And I'm going to get a PhD because education is awesome. And I chose an undergrad that had an IO psychology focus, or they had a certificate or something, and focused on leadership. And that's where I went. And then I literally went on and got a PhD in industrial organizational psychology immediately after undergrad, and became an industrial organizational psychology professor. And then I feel like I should be a more interesting person and do something different at some point, but it's just such an awesome field. I love it.
If we would have followed our high school dreams, I would be a marine biologist.
Well, there's still time. People change careers 5 times. Don't sell yourself short.
But I love what I'm doing. So I guess that, it was meant to be, because when I did find it, I love it.
You can still scuba dive or save sharks or something.
That's true. Which brings me to okay, so you are a professor of biopsychology, just like you said when you were.
Yeah, I was, but then I took a job in a business school. So now I'm a professor of organizational leadership and information analytics.
So what is a typical, lead us through, what does a typical day being Dr. Stefanie Johnson look like? I bet describing a day is kind of difficult. So maybe a week or a month, because you probably do more than just what can be captured in a day.
Sure. Well, I'm going to tell you about today just because. So today I woke up super early, at somewhere around 5 a.m, which I don't really like to wake up that early, and I went to do a online presentation for executive education course at Columbia University. It was online. And then immediately after, I did a presentation about diversity, equity, and inclusion for a major drug company. I doubt they care if I share who it is, but I won't. Mm-hmm. And then drove my little self to a big oil and gas company in Denver and spoke to their executive leadership team, which is the CEO and the chief financial officer and the senior VPs. And then it really got interesting because I jumped in my car and went to a scuba shop, speaking of marine biology, to pick up a scuba mask for my partner. My husband is he's not really a marine biologist, but he's a aquatic ecologist, and he wants to be a marine biologist. It's probably his high school dream too. So in a week from yesterday, we're moving to Curacao, which is an island in the Caribbean, for a year, so he can pursue his marine biology dreams while we're both on sabbatical.
That's amazing.
And then I drove home to do this podcast and see you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
No, my pleasure. And then I think I'm going to go to bed. I'm exhausted.
And because we're also on a time difference. So it's even later for you there. After a full day.
I should probably try to stay awake till 3 p.m., but we'll see.
So I didn't put this in the intro when I introduced you, but one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you come be a guest and to talk about what you're doing is you have this the work that you do, if I could boil it down. So for the audience, Dr. Stefanie Johnson, she has written a best-selling book, Inclusify. She does a lot of work with Popular Press and doing interviews. She's worked with NASA. She's gone to the Whitehouse and presented to the White House. And if I had to boil down what I'm excited to talk to you about is you communicate a lot with people without backgrounds in IO. Right? We could look at each kind of thing that you do, and it's a lot about the communication of our theory and our research. And so those are sort of things that I want to break into. And I want to ask you about what's a project that's particularly memorable that you've got to work on, and it could be research. It could be any of the work that you've done outside of research and communicating that research. Tell me about one of your favorites.
I don't know that I can pick a favorite. That's tough.
It doesn't have to be a favorite, just something that comes to mind when you think that was a great project, or that was enjoyable, or that was effective.
Sure. So I'll say one that stands out to me that I thought was super interesting is 5 years ago. I started a project on women's experience in the workplace. This is one of the things I study is gender equity and women leaders. And we were trying to look at, do qualitative interviews to take a broad stroke about what are the benefits of being a woman in the workplace. What are the challenges? And this one theme that kept coming up was sexual harassment. And we hadn't started out with we weren't intending to ask that question. And this was in 2016. And so we were like,
oh, that's like Me Too era, right?
It's right before Me Too. So Me Too started in, I think it's October. Well, it didn't start, but the big,
right. The
uptick.
Hashtag, right? I remember because they arrested Harvey, and then that Me Too hashtag became like very prominent in social media. And so, like you said, even though that movement had been gaining momentum, right? So, I think it was October 2017.
Okay. But before that, so it was 2016, we had done these interviews. And so we're like, is this really a thing? Like, it's come up over and over again in these interviews. But when you do qualitative studies, you don't interview thousands of people, right? You interview tens, like, between 10 and 40 people. So we decided to do this big survey. So we surveyed hundreds of people, because surveys are, easy relative to interviews. Mm-hmm. And we found these like astronomical levels of sexual harassment. And we wrote a paper for Harvard Business Review about it. And just like trying to say like, hey, this is happening. And I don't think people are really paying attention. And I don't think anyone paid attention to our study either. But then Me Too started, and everyone was shocked, right? Across the world at just like the prevalence of this, that this was still a huge issue. To be fair, every woman, I think, was like, I knew it was happening. And we were like, we knew it was happening.
Yeah.
Because it came out in this research. And then the cool part, I think, of the story, I guess, is that we redid that study 1 year later. And so 2018, like in October, we waited like exactly a year after Me Too. So we kind of had data from a year before Me Too. And then we collected data a year after Me Too to look at the prevalence of sexual harassment. And I think that, the findings were interesting, but I think it's more of the serendipity that I think is kind of cool about research, is you never know where it's going to go. And we didn't start out trying to find this, or, even like the paper we published about it, we're like, we didn't have any hypotheses. We didn't even know that Me Too was going to happen, obviously. But we found that sexual harassment did decline as a result of Me Too. What we think of as sexual harassment, like unwanted sexual attention and like sexual coercion and those kinds of things, which is great. And also the negative effects of sexual harassment on women's experiences at work, like their self-esteem and stuff, also decrease. So that like correlation between having been harassed and having damaged self-esteem decreased. I think because women are like, this is obviously not my problem or my fault. This is like something that's ubiquitous and all women are experiencing it. So I'm not going to take the shame and blame for this. But we also found that gender harassment, the kind of like general negative attitudes toward women, increased as like a unexpected kind of backlash toward Me Too, is how we interpret it. But who knows, right? Like,
right.
This is all just like serendipity.
That happens sometimes, right? Backlash to the backlash.
I know. Yes.
There's all this backlash against sexual harassment, but you can look at that. I've seen studies for race that same thing happens. Yes. That, it's that steps forward, steps back type of thing.
It's so true.
That's very, very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I was like really happy and then like really unhappy, because I'm like, wait, how can I be this happy about women being harassed? I mean, I think it's like gratifying to know that Me Too had an impact, that there's, an immense power that people have through social media and through telling their story that can change the world. And with the like, yes, sexual harassment decreased. Maybe, I don't know why, but like maybe those sexual harassers are like, dang it, I can't sexually harass people anymore. I'm just going to like be mean to them. So that part was like less happy, but just scientifically kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I think about I'm going to transition to some of the other work that you've done, because there is one in particular, Stefanie, I want to ask you about, and that is the presenting at the Whitehouse summit. And the reason that I'm asking it is not for some greater good. It's because I personally, like, in my life of things, that's a bucket list to go be able to stand in front of people and say, this is my expertise and this is what you should know. Like, I think that's, that, and to make changes at that level or suggest changes at that level is just amazing. So that's like, I'm curious because I'm curious about it. So will you tell our audience a little bit about what you presented on and what that experience was like? Like, I'm thinking about the security clearance and the logistics of even just doing that. And can you tell, like, what did you present on and what was it like?
Yeah. So I'll say it was absolutely amazing. The coolest thing ever, because this was the Obama White House. And that, I'll say, for me, was the first administration that I had really gotten politically active around. Was, I live in Colorado, and you probably remember this from when you lived in Colorado. It was kind of like a purple state, right? It's not incredibly conservative. It's not incredibly liberal. Today, I think it's very, very liberal. But so I was like a door knocker for Barack Obama and trying to sway the vote. And Obama did win Colorado, but and now, since then, I think, like, I feel so proud to have supported that administration. It's like, I think amazing things happen. Sorry if your politics are different, but I was a big fan.
I was in Colorado when Barack Obama won. And I know, the Colorado being a purple state, or more purple at the time. Yeah. And him winning Colorado. I mean, it was a really cool moment. So
totally agree. And so I had done this study, a couple of studies actually, focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I don't know, I wrote a Harvard Business Review piece, and someone saw this and found it really interesting. And there was a diversity summit at the White House for corporate America. So it was like a lot of CEOs and also politicians there, focusing on, like, what's the future of diversity, equity, inclusion in corporate America. And I mean, it was cool and crazy. And, I had little kids at the time. They're still relatively little, but they were even littler then. And so, like, getting up and flying to DC was just like a big deal. And then, like, there is a lot of security clearance. And I was terrified, like, shaking in my high-heeled shoes to present on this panel. I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? But it was cool. I just got to share my research. And, like, one thing I'll say, kind of similar to the Me Too research experience, this was such a tipping point in history. So this was also around the same time. I think it was like 2016. And I think the vibe in the room was that, like, haven't we solved gender equity? And, we were advising on, also after the presentation, some policy around pay and equal pay. There's, a lot of things that states have done, including Washington and Colorado, to, like, not ask about pay history. And, it's, if there's pay inequity and companies don't ever have to report it, it's kind of hard to find pay inequity. And so making legislation to try to increase equity, which shouldn't be hard to pass, because, like, who can argue with fairness, right? But I'll say it's just, like, it was super cool and memorable. And I have, like, a tiny White House cookie gingerbread house that is, like, probably so disgusting in my office to, like, commemorate the experience.
Yes, I love that. I don't consider myself a particularly nervous speaker. It's part of, I'd say, as a professor, and you're always presenting research or teaching, it is something that I'm in general okay with. But I just can imagine being at the White House and shaking in my high heels, like, it would ruffle my feathers, but in a way that I think would be exciting. And so thank you for sharing that story. It was absolutely delightful.
Oh, thanks for asking. I'm, like, so happy to even even remembering that is, like, fun. That's because I think it was a big deal for me, but it also, after that, like, I felt like things, definitely not because of me, but I felt like things really started to shift, and there's became more of an emphasis of equality for, I talked about equal pay, but also women on boards. And then I think we're seeing the same thing again. So anyone who wants to invite me to the White House, totally free, about like racial equity and like, do we have racial equity on corporate boards and in executive roles and pay equity? Like, we know we don't, we can't deny it. So what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. I was just talking to a colleague sort of about this and the historical use of the glass ceiling. And I read an article recently about moving away from the glass ceiling and talking about the labyrinth. And that it's not just, at the top, it's you have to fill that talent pipeline the whole way through. Yeah. And so, I look forward to more research and looking at those types of issues. What are you working on now?
Yeah. So, right.
Like what?
No,
what is the
I don't know.
for you?
I loved writing Inclusify. Like that was another, just like one of my best memories are really about, I think, my kids, to be honest, but writing the book was felt so indulgent and fun because some of it I wrote on like my 40th birthday vacation in Thailand. And so I was just like creative by the ocean. Like, what would I want to say if I could force people to listen to me? And I think, as you said, and thanks for saying this, I've really worked on trying to translate the complexities of research into like an understandable, useful business tone, I guess, because we do such great research and no one reads it because they can't understand it. Because frankly, I can't even understand other people's research. I have to like slowly read manuscripts multiple times to be like,
Stefanie, this is such a soapbox. It is such a soapbox for me. And anyone listening can like at me about this because we have such great potential. We do great research. We care about issues. We care about understanding the human condition at work. And then we do a terrible job of telling people about better ways to do things, or more strategic ways, or more intentional and more inclusive, and all of those things that we're knowledgeable about. We don't communicate that knowledge very well. We rely on people like you, and we need more people who are doing exactly what you're saying. If we could make someone listen to us, what would we say and how would we say it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, but it's not easy because, it's like we didn't take communication classes, right? So I think our students are often better communicators and speakers and like good at representing data, in graphs and figures and infographics and stuff. And because I grew up in the 90s, my like representation of data is like I had graph paper, and that's like just not that useful. So, but I loved writing Inclusify, but I don't know that I'm going to do it again, like write another book, maybe. But I think the big thing that kills me is it's so outdated. So this book came out June 2nd of 2020. It's a HarperCollins book. And so this is like a big publisher. I think I turned it into them in 2019. Yeah. So obviously there's no mention of the pandemic and how that's changed the workplace. Like, of course, I mean, there's probably nothing since the Industrial Revolution that has had a bigger impact on the workplace than the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
And there's only one mention of Black Lives Matter, and it's in the context of events that took place in 2016. And it was a big year, apparently. But not 2020 and George Floyd and like all of the unrest and momentum that's followed. And so I think the big thing for me, I don't even know if it's maybe updating Inclusify, but just like checking my assumptions and doing some of the same research again. Like, what a gift. I'm just going to do the same old studies again and see if things have changed, kind of like that Me Too study, to say like, I actually don't know that things are the same anymore, because it's not the same, because we're not in the office. I'm in my basement right now with pink curtains hanging behind me, and you look like you're in your home. I'm guessing that's not your office.
Correct. That's correct.
And the idea of like in Inclusive, I talk about like this theory called optimal distinctiveness theory. And it's the idea that we want to be unique and we want to belong. And it's hard to be unique because we all put on these like costumes and masks when we go to work. And I become like, I'm business professor Stefanie, although I am kind of wearing a suit today because I went and presented to that executive leadership team. Now I primarily sit here in my fuzzy slippers and sweatpants. And I just don't feel the same anymore. I don't feel like I'm going to act like someone else other than me, because it's like, I can't really do that in my own house. And so I think things are just different. And I don't know that this generation of students coming out of college are going to have that same, feel that same pressure to just conform. And I don't even know if they're willing anyway, because the Gen Zers, I just don't think are as easily pressured into conformity, or same with millennials as I was. Like, I just felt like that's just what you do. You just like go fit in.
Yeah.
But I think it's just a different world. And I want to capture that and study that and make sure, like, even when I just taught a course on inclusive leadership and I use these case studies and I'm like, dang, these things feel so outdated. And they're from 2019. It's not that old, but like, it's just, things feel very different to me today. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I hope it is. But I want to study it. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're saying brings up an important point about like, we evolve as people, we evolve as a culture, we evolve, the organizations that we're studying evolve.
Yeah.
And so there's no one endpoint where you're like, hey, I did this study on gender and harassment. Let's call it a day and move on. Or any of these, whatever it is we're studying, it's we're constantly, and organizations are constantly adapting to whatever's happening. And so that research, like you said, you really could do the same study over and over, and you're going to see variability. And that itself, I think, is one worth studying, and two, I think just worth acknowledging that.
Yeah.
That's why we have to stay updated. It's why we can't sort of say, well, I learned about I took this one diversity, equity, and inclusion class, so I'm knowledgeable about that, because it is constantly moving and changing, and we're learning new things. And I think you're right. I think students know that better than we do, quite honestly. Students, if you're listening, right? I hope you know that better.
You know that, yeah.
Which leads us into this last little question that I want to ask you to sort of wrap us up is, a lot of the people that are listening are going to be students. And as you think about them and them moving into the workforce, even if they're not going to be IO psychologists, but what sort of advice might you give them about the workforce, or taking your own area of expertise like gender equity or racial inclusion? What would you tell them? Now you get to say, hey, they have to listen to me. What's something that might help them be successful in their careers that they should know?
Yeah. So much. So I'll say, like, this generation of students is my favorite by far. I think millennials were cool too. But the funny thing about being a college professor is every year I get older. This is a bummer, but every year my students are the same age. So I've watched how people change over the last 20 years, because I know what 18 to 22-year-olds care about today. And I know what they cared about 20 years ago, and it's different. And one of the things that's so great about this generation to me, these Gen Zers, is that they've grown up with an expectation around equity and inclusion and diversity. Like, they're the first generation that is in a majority, has a majority non-white demographic. And I think they have greater expectation for gender equality. More of, kids today have dual earner parents. And so, they think they might see more equity in their parents' relationship, and they have more of an expectation for that. And then what's so cool about them is, even, I'll say, and I don't know if this is like a CU Boulder thing, but even for those students who might be majority group members, they have that expectation for how others are going to be treated too. And so they're looking for companies that are going to allow them to be successful. Like, they're really, really focused on, well, I'm going to invest in you as a company. What are you going to invest in me? And at the same time asking, and like, what are you doing for other people? How do I know that this treatment's going to be fair? And so I guess that's my advice, is like, hang on to that, because that is what makes this generation unique and special, and why they're going to change the world for the better. Because we didn't go into, or I'll say my generation, didn't go into organizations thinking like there should be equity. I think, you know, I might've thought, oh yeah, it'd be great if there's equity, but I think I was more like, I hope I can like slip in under the radar and no one will catch me at the door, and, you know, they'll let me through the gates. And my goal is just to make it through. And so then hopefully I can lean a hand down and support other women, and I'm Mexican American, so other Latinx and underrepresented individuals once I make it through. But I think this generation's like, this is how we're coming in. Like, we know we're talented. We know there's a war for talent. I want to work in organizations that are going to support me and support others in an equitable way. And this is like, also like, there's been some, you know, financial downturns with the pandemic, but I hear my students saying, hanging on to that idealism. And I think that is beautiful and wonderful. And organizations need you, right? They need workers. And so I think with that continued emphasis and that need, they're going to have to listen. And so I think just like hold strong. You're the people that can do it. I think this is hopefully a major tipping point in our history as a country. And I think that you all, anyone, you know, who's listening and is a student, really have the potential to be part of that by hanging tight, hanging strong on supporting equity and inclusion, being an ally, being a mentor, and also supporting our own groups as well, so that we can create greater equity.
Yeah, I loved hearing you talk about that, because I feel the same way about students. Because I think, I'm going to share this story really quick, is our family has a cabin, and we don't get to see the neighbors very often because you only go when it's nice weather. And the neighbor's an elderly gentleman, and he came across and he's like, oh yeah, you're a professor. I was like, yeah. And he kind of gave the like, kids today. You know, like, and I responded, yeah, they're amazing. I mean, I am so impressed with our students. And I think the two things I heard you say were sort of idealism and accountability to the companies they're working for. And I think that does capture it perfect. That is what I'm seeing, is that they can picture a world with equity and inclusion, and they expect that. And I think that as they move into the workforce, I think they're going to move it and shake it in ways that we already in the workforce haven't done yet.
That's right.
And I think that's exciting, and I think that's cool. And I have goosebumps talking about it, because it is sincerely so exciting for you folks to think about, you students, my students, everyone's students. Like you said, yes, there's the pandemic and some economic downturns, but holding on to that, I think, just make the workplace a better place for everybody.
Yeah. And be an IO psychologist, because we are at the forefront of making these changes happen, and supporting the structures and organizations that are going to make it a reality. And I want to tell you too, so I said, I'm not writing another book, but I totally am co-authoring an industrial organizational psychology textbook that is going to be, darn it, the very first gender and racially equitable textbook. So in this book, I think it's industrial organizational psychology, and it's Riggio and Johnson, and it should come out next year, but you know, it's been a rough year, so we'll see. But like, we were very intentional about the examples we put in there to be gender and racially diverse, and have the policies and practices we talk about have an emphasis on things like LGBTQ plus and disability and mental health. And we put the pandemic. And then even the scholars whose research we cited, we made sure to cite and to read, not just like, oh, you know, what's the quintessential study that comes to mind when I talk about training. And I think about like a majority, you know, like the most widely cited one, but actually think about like, well, whose work isn't always spotlighted in these books. And the textbook is amazing by doing that effort. I think just like, it's a little bit more interesting and richer because we tried to capture the things that I don't know, people are more interested, like not like everyone, not just the majority.
Well, and I think, yes, that's interesting and enriching, but also it's reflective of the multiple roles that people have and the intersectional identities and all of those things. Like, those people exist in organizations because those people exist. And
that's right.
writing a textbook that reflects that is awesome. I can't wait to read it. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I'll send you it.
Yes.
Hopefully, maybe you'll use it. No pressure, honest. No pressure.
So first, I just want to say thank you for your time, Stefanie. It has been so delightful to catch up and to hear about your work and your experiences and sharing with our audience some of the things that you've learned along the way. Has been a great, and we're already like just at time, which is hard to imagine.
Oh.
Is there any last thing that we didn't cover that you like want to shout out into the ether to tell listeners?
No, just I'm so happy to see you and hear about your successes and that you're doing this because, I don't, like you said very eloquently, I don't know that we always do a great job translating the amazing work that we do as IO psychologists to the consumers of IO psychology, which are like employees, which is everyone. And so efforts like this, I just think are so important for making sure that we elevate voices and make sure that our awesome practices are actually put in place to make organizations better. Because we're secret do-gooders. People don't know that about IO psychologists.
Yes.
But all we're trying to do is make things better.
All right. Well, I'm really excited for you to go spend a year is it on an island? Correct?
It's an island. Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to go nuts because I'm like more of a city girl, but I do love beaches. So.
Well, either way, I hope you enjoy it with your family and you get some time to do some cool work, writing the book, which I'm very excited for. Yes. So thank you,
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.